Hi and welcome back to Bike Speed. So this week we're going to sort out this Claud Butler Odyssey. We're going to put a new chain on this one. We're going to put a new 6-speed rear hub on here. We're going to do the bottom bracket bearings. We're going to sort out the headset bearings. We're going to change the brakes, and we're going to generally service this bike and get it back up to spec and looking really nice for this customer. He told me the story that this had belonged to his father. He'd been loaned it by his mum to use, and actually he became very sentimentally attached to the bike, and so he's just asking us to service it to really bring it up nice in the memory of his father, and I think that's a lovely reason to have a bike serviced. So as you can see from these before shots, it's quite grimy, but it's not overdue. It's okay, it's not too bad. You can see the chain is stretched right off, which is why we also decided to change the 6-speed block on the back. The front chain set I think will be okay. You can see there's a lot of slack in the chain, but the teeth themselves don't look too bad when I take that chain off, so I don't think they're going to skip on the front. So initially we're just going to test with a new chain and a new block on the rear, and it should be okay from there. So initially we're going to strip the bike down. We'll get some parts off to put in the Ultrasonic cleaner, some parts like this that we'll replace. You can see it doesn't look too bad, but with that chain stretched out the way it was, I know a new chain will skip over that, so we'll swap that one out for a new one. So we'll get the derailleurs cleaned up, we'll get some bearings sorted out, and in general this bike will look lovely once it's done. You can see here it's quite well oiled, it's quite full of grease and oil, quite a lot of road film and dirt and debris as well, as you can see on the back of this one. But once this is all cleaned up, all these components will be fully operational, and the bike will look lovely once it's done. So we get the chain set off, because the bottom bracket on this one, I could feel that it actually spanned beautifully, which would suggest the bearings weren't too bad, but the grease had begun to dry out. You can actually see a little piece of the grease on the square taper there. So once we did this, we actually took this all apart, put all the cups through the Ultrasonic cleaner, re-greased the bearings, put back in, so we had a nice new feeling bottom bracket here. Fortunately for us, all these parts came out. Sometimes these are a nightmare to get undone. You may have noticed that in other videos where we'll sometimes these cup in one side, but thankfully with this bike it was fully serviceable. Everything came apart nicely, but you can see that build up of grime, dirt, debris in those bearings and those cups there. So once we flushed all that out, it'll be like new again. Off come the brakes. Now we had a little bit of an issue with the brakes. We actually thought we would be able to fix them, but we couldn't, so we swapped those out. We'll show you that along the way. You can see the road build up on the forks there. We'll get all those cleaned up, get it all repolished, and then this bike will absolutely look beautiful once it's done. It was a pleasure to do this bike. So you can see here, these are the brake adjusters on both front and rear. The plastic had snapped in half. It's a very common issue with these brakes. What would have happened was, as the bike was getting used, they'd have flexed out, eventually would have given on all 4 of them, and the brakes would have failed. So it was a timely service from that point of view of getting them sorted out. So we'll swap those out for a new set. So we're just going to clean up the jockey wheels. You can see there's quite a lot of debris built up on those, especially on that one there. You can see when you clump that together, every time you do a pedal stroke, you're pulling your chain through that debris. It just isn't an economical or smooth way of riding. So we'll get all those cleaned up, everything in the Ultrasonic cleaner, get them all spotlessly clean, so that the bike is looking lovely when it goes out. So this is our Ultrasonic cleaner, so we're just getting all the parts in there. And once they've gone through there, we run those for about 15 minutes. We then wash them down, which is what I'm beginning to do here. This is a water soluble degreaser, so that means you can wash it off. So we put the items through the Ultrasonic cleaner, then we wash that fluid off of the part that we've used to degrease them, which also will wash off any debris of grease or oil, as you can just see here. So that's all now softened up with the degreaser. Wash that off, and we've got parts that are then looking like brand new. We actually even did these bearing sets on these, because the bearings, there wasn't a lot wrong with them. The grease had just built up with thickness and age and just needed freshening up on that bottom bracket. Even the chain set, I mean, what a huge difference we made to that. It was quite satisfying to see this piece come up so nicely. The aluminium parts on it cleaned up nice, the plastic parts in the centre there cleaned up nice, the rings themselves all came up lovely, so it was pleasurable to do that one. So once we've got everything clean, we then go through our lubricate process. In this instance we're using a premium grease on the jockey wheels just to give those a little bit of lubrication. We'll lubricate the thumb adjuster as we're doing here. We use a little bit of copper slip anti-seize on the thread and a little bit of general purpose on the actual slider of the thumb adjuster itself. Just make it a little bit easier for me to do any adjustments moving down the line, and not only when we service a bike, but also in a month or two's time if he needs to adjust, things aren't going to have seized up there. So a little bit of Loctite 222 on the jockey wheel pivot points there, and a little bit of lubrication on the actual pivot points of the derailleur themselves, and then a little bit of premium grease on the spring just to stop that going rusty, and the same process on the front derailleur. So we're lubricating the pivot points, greasing the spring just to stop it going rusty, and everything there again is absolutely spot on. I also do the quick release skewers. They can stick inside the axle of a wheel if you get a little bit of rust build up in there. I've had those stuck before where we've had to extract them out. It's not an easy job, so that's nice just to get those lubricated. And this is routine servicing really. Front headset bearing had come loose, a lot of play in it. It was all because this lock ring had come loose, so we adjusted the headset bearing itself, tightened up that lock ring. They were very, very smooth, so they didn't need regreasing or sorting out. Everything there was fine. And then before I put the new 6-speed on here, just going to give that hub a little bit of a clean up just to make sure everything's okay there, so you can see how beautiful that come up. It's a lovely thing with these older bikes is how nice these components always clean up. They always come up so nice, and they're always a pleasure to do. This is where my heart and soul is with bike mechanics. I do love an older bike like this just because the parts are so nicely machined, and you almost imagine someone on a lathe or a turning machine producing these parts somewhere in an old style factory. Another thing which I often mention in videos, but this was a classic example of it, is a tyre that is rotating the wrong way round. So this was no exception. The tyre was on back to front, so we'll get that off, turn it over, and then at least we know that the water will be clearing away from the centre of the tyre instead of coming into the centre of the tyre with a wet puddle. So the water will now pull out away from the tyre edge instead of coming into the centre. So that's why your tyres should really be on the right way around, is more in the wet weather, just to make sure that the bike operates as it should in wet weather. So we've got this all stripped down, as you can see, so we're just going to give everything a wash up. So we're just using a little bit of a detailing brush just to get that initial surface off. We've sprayed this with a soapy water cleaner and wash everything down, and it just absolutely pops out at you. And then we will dry this down with a microfiber towel, and then we're actually going to give this bike a polish as well. So we concentrate on the areas that are built up with grease and debris with the sort of initial cleaning process. So we'll clean the threads in the bottom bracket here, and we'll clean the parts where there's a build up of grease and debris, like around the brakes here, and just make sure that all this sort of initial debris is off. And then we'll give the bike a full wash down and dry off before we start the rebuild process. So that's what I'm now doing. We use what we call the big softy brush. This is a lovely soft brush, a nylon brush. It's just almost like using a sponge on the bike to wash it down. So we've now done the wash down, and next up we're just going to use the super resin polish just to polish this frame, just to really get this paint to shine out at us. But also this just gives it a little bit of water protection, a little bit of UV protection, just the all-round protection against the sort of the future riding. You'll find that mud will not stick to this as deep as it would to a dry paint. You can see even on that Claud Butler logo there, the way that's starting to reflect the light, just with a nice polish up like this. This was just a standard service, but very occasionally when I hear a story and knowing that this belonged to his father, it's just worth sometimes pushing the extra mile, especially when we're filming a bike. So we actually went for the full polish on this bike as well, which maybe we wouldn't have done on a normal service. We'd have just washed the bike down. But this one was a special bike, so we just give this a little bit extra. A couple of things I did notice whilst washing down, which is again why I do this process, is things like this front reflector loose in the frame. So a little bit of a tighten up there. That's much better. That'll stop that rattling or coming undone. Things like this rear mudguard bridge, again, completely loose. That's finger tight. So tighten that up, which again, you kind of feel these things as you're doing the wash down. And obviously as I came across the back mudguard, I noticed this rear reflector. So that'll rattle, cause little rattles and little noises. Tighten that up, much better. 3 little things there, just noticed whilst washing it down. So now we're on the rebuild process. So initially we're going to use our lovely premium grease to get these bearings lubricated up. A little bit of copper slip in the threads where the cups themselves are going to thread in. You can see there, literally I spun that in by hand. So it's a lovely way of improving what was there. I had a real job getting these out, and yet they spun in nicely going in. So we've got everything in there nicely. Just up the bearing itself before we put the lock ring on. So I'm now happy with that. Put the lock ring on, just hold that, and we've got everything there nice. On goes the chain set itself. I mean, look at that, it looks brand new, doesn't it? You can see here the cap, the old cap there had a little bit of black rubbing on it, probably from a shoe from the rider at some point has rubbed that. So we just put a new little cap in the center, and same on this side, a new little cap. It's just the little detail that just makes all the difference to the way the bike is presented to the customer. And this bottom bracket, look at this, look, you don't get out of a modern seal bearing, do you? I mean, that just spins for England. That's incredible, really. You know, that's an old bike. That's had loads of wear, and yet the way that spins, you don't get that with modern bikes. There's some things that, through improvements with bearing seals and things, aren't really an improvement. I much prefer that old one there. We're starting to put the bike back together now. You can see now I just shortened the front derailleur cable because the tail was just a little bit long. That would have clipped against the front pedal arm. We then begin to know that we're getting there with this now, and we just put on the brakes. So we're just putting a new set of brakes on here because of those plastic cups that were broken. A little bit of copper slip on the threads of the bolts that are holding this on. A little bit of general purpose grease on the pivot points themselves, just so the brakes actuate and release nicely. And that's now looking absolutely spot on. Again, because we changed the brakes, we're going to put new cables on this bike as well. So we'll have a new front and rear brake cable, which will just be absolutely perfect. So the brakes when this bike left were really actuating quite nicely. New cables on here. These are stainless steel cables. A lot of old bikes tend to have a galvanized steel cable, but in this instance we're using a stainless steel cable. We use what we call our super slick cables, which are nice tightly wound stainless steel, very smooth through your fingers. When you run them through your fingers, you can really tell the difference on a quality cable to standard cables. So that's what we're using there. Again, on the rear, a little bit of general purpose grease on the pivot point of the brake, a little bit of copper slip on the thread that holds the brake together. That will ensure that we can get that component apart in the future if we ever need to. So we've got brand new brake pads on here as well. The old brake pads that were on the bike were very old, very dry and quite worn as well. So the whole thing on this is an improvement to the way the bike was. New cable right the way through the frame with those lovely fittings on the crossbar there. You can see they're actually welded on. Again, a very nice feature of older bikes, the way that even the frames were thought out a little bit more meticulously than some modern frames. And then on goes the new cable again on the rear, that lovely super slick cable, before we start getting the wheel and the chain and everything else back on the bike. So at this stage, we're now looking quite good. Once the wheels are on, we just adjust those brakes, shorten off the cables there. You can see I just used the cable guide to get the cable lengths the same front and back. On goes a lovely new chain, a nice silver chain, which you can see is just a much higher quality chain than what was on the bike. Check the gears, maybe a little bit of thumb adjustment on those, maybe a little high-low screw adjustment if needed. And you can see brakes are working perfectly, gears are shifting perfectly. The bike is now absolutely spot on. Completely different place to when it came in. And again, you can just see there, look, they're quite loose on the bottle holder there. So we just go through the frame, torque what we can. A lot of these older bikes tend to be done by feel rather than have specific torque settings, but we do all that, check all the accessories, front to back through the bike with the check-in. Oil on the chain. Again, we're oiling the rollers of the chain, not so much the chain itself. Those rollers in the center there that I'm oiling actually spin individually. That's what you're trying to oil when you're oiling your chain. So you can see from these before and after shots what a huge difference we've made to this bike. It was a really satisfying bike to do this work on, especially knowing the backstory to the bike. Thoroughly enjoyed doing this one. So I hope you've enjoyed it too. Do drop a comment about your older bikes and maybe sentimentality of a bike. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget, comment, do like the video as well. Do subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.